Senhoras e senhores, muito bom dia. Sejam bem-vindos ao segundo dia da Conferência Anual
Central Bank
do
of
Banco Central do
Brazil
Brasil
2025 Annual Conference.
Neste ano,
This year, the Central Bank of Brazil is partnering with the Credit Guarantee Fund, FGC, to organize the annual conference. We also have the support of the following institutions: Brazil Association of Payment Institutions, ABPAG, Brazil Association of Financial and Capital Market Entities, ANBIMA, Brazilian Federation of Banks, FEBRABAN, ZETA, Association of Technology Companies Operating in the Financial and Means of Payment Sector, Brazilian Association of Banks, ABBC, and National Association of Credit, Financing and Investment Institutions, ACREF. Today's agenda includes academic sessions, which will be recorded and made available at a later date on the events page on the Central Bank of Brazil's website. We will start the day with a keynote speech, which will be broadcast on the Central Bank of Brazil's YouTube channel. We have invited Izabela Correa, Deputy Governor of Relations, Citizenship, and Conduct Supervision at the Central Bank of Brazil. And our speaker, Michael McMahon, Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford. We hand the floor over to Deputy Governor Izabela to moderate the session. Thank you for the introduction. So let's kickstart the presentation and the introduction right away.
I'll excuse myself and I'll introduce you in Portuguese and then I'll give you the floor. Professor
McMahon is a renowned economist. He's currently professor of economics at the Oxford University, senior research fellow. He has an academic career of great distinction. He has taught in prestigious institutions such as Chicago Booth, LBC, LLC. Besides, he has a large practical experience, having worked on the Bank of England and collaborated with the training institution of IMF in Singapore. His interests of research encompass macroeconomics with a specific focus on monetary policy communication, which is the topic of today's lecture. Professor McMahon has been emphasized by his contributions in analyzing how communication of monetary policies can be used not only for specialized policies, but also for the public in general. He investigates how clarity and transparency in communication might influence economic expectations and the efficacy of policies implemented. His research has been fundamental for understanding how different strategies of communication might improve comprehension and answers of markets to monetary policies, contributing to a more stable and foreseeable policy. Today, Professor McMahon will share with us his valuable perceptions about what we already know regarding the effects of monetary policy communication and also what we still have to learn, bringing a unique communication with a lot of academic quality and practice. So we welcome Professor Michael McMahon. You have the floor.
While my slides come up, let me thank Izabela for the introduction. I've been here a few days and I had a great pleasure in the last few days of engaging with bank staff and other partners, and we talked a lot about central bank communication. My Portuguese is still not up to the standards, but I recognized some of the words related to me, so thank you. I've also learned that when I'm in Brazil, I can just say obrigado. So that's where we are. Okay, let me see. Oh, maybe is somebody else controlling this, or is it me? No, it's me. It's okay. I've got it. This is one of the great joys of being an academic is you have to do all of your own AV, so you become very skilled at the technical stuff. Well, thank you very much for having me. As I said, this has been a wonderful experience the last few days, Monday, Tuesday at the training center speaking with staff, and then yesterday at the conference. This talk is monetary policy communication, and it's rather self-indulgent, but I've put the bracket around my. It's mostly about my research because when someone asks me to give a talk, that's the stuff I know best. But I will try and draw on the general lessons that we have from the literature. And I base the whole talk around two real big questions. And if you will, they separate a lot of the research into two types of central bank communication. One you might think of as the traditional central bank communication. That is, how do we talk to the financial markets, to the wider world, to make sure messages are understood? The quote already came up in the conference yesterday, but I leave it up there anyway. This is the Ben Bernanke quote about monetary policy being 98% talk and 2% action. So there is still a lot, even though Ben Bernanke has asked a question, we do not yet have the full answer. So a lot of this talk is about what we do know, but also to try and highlight for the many researchers in this room that there's many, many questions still to be answered, and therefore it's a fruitful ground for research in your PhD, in your research in the bank, or wherever you do your research. The second main questions relate to a rather new phenomenon. That is, many central banks are actively trying to talk to the general public. The general public, I sometimes get in trouble by calling them normal people. That's not to say economists and financial markets are not normal, but they're different. They are trained in a different language. I always say to people, economics is like a language. Within a central bank, we talk to each other with words that out on the street, most people wouldn't follow along, at least perfectly. This language is important, and it's important that it has a precise meaning. But once we start to talk to a wider audience, we have to think more carefully about how we can be understood, or how do we get through to them. So that's the second part of the talk. And the whole talk will draw on a bunch of my research, but I try to draw 15 non-comprehensive lessons. So this is not to say we're done, these questions are answered, close the book. I will say one other thing. I gave a similar talk not quite a year ago, and I had 13 lessons. So you'll be glad to know that inflation is alive and well in the lessons. But it does also tell us that we are learning new things, there's new research, there's new ideas, and as we get more answers, I will get more lessons. So maybe if you have me back in 10 years, you can have the 30 lessons of central bank communication. But I will start, because this is a technical audience, with where monetary economists often start their thinking, and that is with the new Keynesian model. Now, the new Keynesian model is the workhorse of most central banks. This is a very particular, very popular model. At most graduate programs, you will learn this model. In many central banks, they will use some version of this model for their thinking. It's a very nice model. However, if what you want to think about is communication and information, the standard version of the model is not a great place to start. The reason for that, it generally assumes full information. So everybody, households, firms, central bankers, understand everything about the economy. They know the current data perfectly well. They know the exact structure of the economy. And all of those different types of people have what we call rational expectations. Namely, not only do they know all of this stuff, they are perfectly able to plug it all into the MATLAB model code, project it forward, and form the best possible expectations today. It doesn't mean they always get it right, because there are shocks, there are random events in the model, but they all, households, firms, and central bankers, all form the best possible forecast. More than that, the households and the firms know exactly what the central bank thinks, how it makes its decisions, what its objective function is. Essentially, what the baseline model does is it assumes perfect communication across a lot of the dimensions that we will think about. Nonetheless, when you get this model, you get these equations. If there's anybody in the audience who hated graduate macro, and these two equations are bringing nightmares, I promise they will only be here for another minute. We can take these equations, and the really key thing in this model is that monetary policy works through its changes to the real interest rate. And the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate that the central bank sets, less these expected inflation. So you can move the real interest rate either with the nominal rate, as we think, as the Bank of Brazil did when they raised rates last week, or it can move if expectations for inflation move. You can take this model because it's so forward-looking and beautiful, and you can see that what really matters is a long future path of real interest rate gaps. This has some really interesting features that I think have come up in discussions of monetary policy around the world recently. So one of them is what Hugh Pill, the chief economist at the Bank of England, has famously described as the choice for monetary policy makers between the Matterhorn approach. The Matterhorn is the mountain as you look at the screen on the left that looks like a piece of Toblerone, rising sharply and coming back down, versus Table Mountain, the famous mountain in Cape Town, which is very flat. Why is this at all relevant? Well, if you go back again to these equations, what really matters is the sort of total sum of interest rate gaps discounted into the future. So you can either do a lot early on and then quickly come back to something more normal, or you can be a little bit tight for a long, long, long time, like Table Mountain, and in the model, they can be exactly the same. Now, in reality, the model doesn't capture some things. On the Matterhorn, there is the risk of doing too much. You raise really aggressively, you stress financial markets, and now, while you're trying to fight inflation, you suddenly have financial stability issues to also deal with. That's not fun for central bankers. You want to try to avoid that. On the other side, with Table Mountain, there's the risk of not doing enough. Saying we're going to be a little bit tight for 3 years might not convince the public in reality that you'll do enough to stop inflation. And if you don't do enough to stop inflation, they start to expect more inflation. And as more inflation comes, it's as if you're cutting the interest rate because the real interest rate falls. So then you get into chasing your tail of inflation going up, and you're trying to stop it, but you're never quite doing enough. Neither of those are in the beautiful baseline model that we teach in graduate school, but they come, and these are real issues we have to think about. Let me immediately put a thought about communication in here. If you do the Table Mountain approach, you would have to act to try to convince people that what you're doing is enough. It will be enough to bring it down. And if you're credible, and this word credibility comes into our models a lot, that will matter greatly. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some work I've done with some colleagues at the Central Bank of Ireland. And this, again, is trying to bridge between the stylized model and the reality. So it's not the full reality. I'm not going to describe exactly what all of you hardworking economists in the Bank of Brazil do, but the way I view the job is in two broad stages. First of all, there is a lot of data. On my screen, that's the ex-central bank, the XCB. That's the data available to you in month M. And one of the jobs you do as policymakers, as the staff supporting the policymakers, is you try to take that big mass of data and figure out what is the real state of the world today. What shocks have hit? Where are we going? Will we have inflation that's transitory? Will it be more persistent? The challenge is that because it's such a big problem, if you're an econometrician, if you want to think about this as a big filtering problem, the challenge with this is every month you could look at it and get different exact answers, or you could learn about things. Or, Izabela and I, we could look at the same data and come to different conclusions because we weight things a bit differently, we assess things a bit differently. We should not hide from the fact that central banks are also subject to the same uncertainty as everybody else. Once you've decided that, you can then go to the second step, which is deciding, given that state of the world and where it's going, what is the appropriate choice of interest rate? Again, you could choose the Matterhorn, you could choose the Table Mountain. This will partly come down to the current state of the bank's balance sheets. This will partly come down to how credible you think you are. And as these things evolve, how you react to the same state of the world might have to be different. Why have I said all of that? I've said all of that to contrast with the very starting point of the new Keynesian model. In the new Keynesian model, everybody knows all the data perfectly, everybody knows the structure of the economy perfectly, and everybody can form the exact same best forecasts. In reality, nobody gets the perfect forecast. Nobody has exactly the same views necessarily, and those views can change from month to month, from year to year on how we assess the world. Because of that, there is a lot of information that is imperfect, and that puts central bank communication at a sort of key place for communicating how you react to policy, how you assess the world, but also how you might react if things don't go as you think they will. So here, those are my first three lessons that come. So in the models, because they're forward-looking, understanding how policy will react going forward is key. In practice, you have to try to communicate that. This is hard. Lesson 3 will talk about why it's hard. Lesson 2 is we also have to be able, as policymakers, to talk about what we make of the economy today. What's our view of what shocks are hitting? How do we interpret the labor market data? How do we see inflation evolving? Lesson 3 goes back to lesson 1. In our models, forward guidance, this idea that we communicate deviations from some known reaction function, forward guidance is the most prominent, talked about form of communication in the standard new Keynesian model because it's the only real one. As a result, I think we've put too much emphasis on forward guidance. That's not to say I don't like forward guidance. I think forward guidance can be useful to communicate how you see the world evolving and your reaction function. Where central banks have gotten in trouble is trying to do the full commitment version, where they say, this is what we will have and we will stick with it for a long time. There have been central bank governors around the world who have lost their jobs as a result of that commitment, because as we know, when the world changes, policy has to change, and that's often true with forward guidance. One of the things that comes with the imperfect information is the concept of uncertainty. Now, there is uncertainty in our standard models. It is the stochastic uncertainty that comes from the distribution of the shocks. It is usually added as a linear thing at the end. What myself and a number of co-authors, particularly Anna Cieslak on a number of papers, and I'll cite some of them up here. So this is one with Anna, Stephen Hansen, my longtime co-author, and Song Zhao, where we look within the Federal Open Market Committee and we ask how policymakers' uncertainty affects their behavior. Now, we have models of this. Many of you will have heard of Brainard uncertainty, where you don't understand the state of the model that drives the world, therefore you react in a particular way. We find something that's actually a bit different. What we find is very much in line with what Alan Greenspan used to call the risk management approach to monetary policy. Namely, you form your view of where you think we're going, but you equally think a lot about what you might have to do on paths that are not that world. And in particular, what we find over Alan Greenspan's term, Bernanke's term, and into Janet Yellen's term, is that a lot of the worry was what we would call the traditional concern of central bankers. And that is, they have inflation relatively under control, but the worry is that they will fall behind the curve and inflation will start to run away from them. So particularly at times when the economy was doing quite well, policymakers would express a lot of concern that although inflation looks good now, what if it starts to go up? What if we're slow to raise? What if we're not in front of the curve? And as a result, even if they didn't move interest rates, we show evidence that they talked about these scenarios, these higher inflation scenarios, and the fact that they would then be tougher with raising interest rates. They would raise them faster, more aggressively. They may not have to raise them, but they talked about it. And this made us think, well, surely that could influence how they talk, not just within themselves, but also outside to the wider world. And so in follow-up work, one paper with Anna and another ongoing paper with Anna and Hao Pang, we look at how central bank communication of these issues affects financial markets. And let me just summarize all of this work with the following view. Despite what we think and what we have in our models, it's not the policy rate on its own that really matters. Very few entities in society can borrow at the central bank rate. Central bank rates are typically short-term rates, whereas businesses, if they want to build a new factory, or households, if they want to buy a new car, they don't borrow overnight, weekly, monthly interest rates. They tend to borrow a 5-year or a 10-year or a 20-year loan. So what really matters for central banks in affecting financing conditions is affecting those longer-term, medium-term and longer-term interest rates. The key idea in this work with Anna and the further work with Hao as well is that it's both the actions and the words in Bernanke's quote that determine these longer-term rates that matter, and they then help, affect financial conditions which affect the economic outcomes. But you have to recognize that there's short-run expectations, they're standard in our model, but you can also have term or risk premia that are built into these rates. And what we show is evidence in the US that markets at different points in time have different worries about mistakes that the policymakers could be making. In fact, we show that then when they're worrying about you making a mistake, so if the market starts to think rates are too low, they're behind the curve on inflation, policymakers going out and expressing that they recognize this risk and that they are ready and willing to raise rates aggressively when they see signs of inflation actually can lower risk premia, and that brings financing conditions more in line with what they want. I'm going to show you a very small bit of maths again. Apologies if you don't like this. But it all stems from the idea about what a monetary policy shock is. We often put these in our models, and if you're not an academic or you're not a researcher, they serve as an important tool for us to think about shocks in the economy. But if you think deeply about them, one place that they could come up, and this is from the original Gali book, is an error in the implementation of monetary policy or a response to an unusual or unanticipated event. One other way you can see them is as perceived mistakes. So Caballero and Simsek have a lovely paper that looks at this in a sort of information model. We sort of lay out the idea. Imagine the market is sitting there and they have their view of what the right interest rate should be. So they think the interest rate should be X is the output gap, pi is the inflation, and they have their preferred coefficients to react to. So they know this and they think that's what the central bank should be doing. But the central bank might not do that. They might use different coefficients. They might have a different view of the economy, either inflation or the output gap. If you then sort of write this thing down, you can show that this shock, the monetary policy shock that we so know and love, is the difference between what the market thinks should be the interest rate and what the actual interest rate chosen is. In other words, it's a mistake in the eyes of the market. Just to be very clear to my very kind policymaker hosts, I didn't say the market was right. But from their perception, we've all had arguments where we're certain we're right, but so is the other side. Okay? But if I'm in that argument, from my perspective, the other person is making a mistake. Now, history might show the central bank was right. But at a given point in time, they think you're wrong. We can now write this in my language as a particular thing, and then we can split it down. Let's imagine two specific things they worry about. Imagine we know the economy's been hit by a shock, but we don't know how much it's a demand shock and how much it's a productivity supply shock, and the net balance matters for the output gap. So the central bank has a different view where this sort of eta with this sort of little smiley face above it indicates the difference of opinion, or in the market's view, the mistake the central bank is making. They also could disagree about some of the reaction function coefficients. Let's imagine they just disagree about how aggressively to respond to inflation. Again, the market thinks, the market perceives, the market could be wrong, but the market perceives that the central bank is not using the right reaction function. You can sort of put values on these, and then we can actually describe the error, the shock, as made up of the market thinking the central bank hasn't assessed the world correctly, so they don't think you're very good at economic analysis. In the words of my earlier work, they don't think you do your filtering exercise as well as they do. Or they think you react in an incorrect way. You're not, I'm going to talk about it as if you're not hawkish enough. You're a bit too dovish. Okay? You can kind of chase these things through. We make particular assumptions. Let me just jump through. I won't bore you with those. The slides are available for anyone who wants them. What this comes to is a risk premium will then depend on how likely the central bank is to make the mistakes. When they price assets, they will price in possible mistakes. And the mistakes have two elements. One is a concern about your ability to assess the economy correctly, and the other is a concern about type. Now, what we show in the paper is that central banks can actively try to manage these. I'm not saying you can get rid of them fully, but you can acknowledge where there's uncertainty. You can explain why you think the economy is this way, and you can explain what evidence would cause you to change your view. And if they're worried about your type, you can again reiterate your strength of determination to fight inflation. The fact that right now you don't think inflation is a problem, but if it comes up, you will be very aggressive. Those words, that talk, that communication can change the market's assessment of the likelihood of these mistakes, and in doing so, change the risk premia. Let me show you, I'm going to skip that one. I want to show you I will show you the first one, sorry. There's this period after COVID, a very interesting and difficult time for the world, but then for central banks, because during COVID, they wanted to support the economy, so they kept rates low. You can see that the central bank, the Fed, actually had communicated forward guidance that said they wouldn't raise rates for a long time, and that was built into the expectations. However, over that period of forward guidance, inflation started to go up and up. And if we all remember the team transitory versus team persistent argument, initially it was like, it's okay. Markets got less and less feeling like it was okay. And you can see that although the Fed wanted conditions to be loose, to support the economy, markets was automatically tightening the financial conditions because the term premia on 10-year bonds starts going up and up and up over this. And it goes up both in reaction to FOMC events in the early days and in relation to macro releases. So they see the data and they think, that looks more inflationary than the Fed thinks. I'm more worried now. Oh, look, the Fed have come out and said they're still not changing rates. I'm more worried now. And so they had tightening of policy even though the Fed did not want that. You can't eliminate all of this, but one of my takeaways is if you're a policymaker, you can't eliminate all uncertainty, but you certainly don't want to be the source of uncertainty. So you should try to minimize that. You can see that this little X, if it appears on the screen and you can see it, is around the time of the Fed's hawkish pivot. When they started raising by 75, 75, 75, and you can see you got quite a big drop, particularly then as the data started coming in these term premia. Okay? We did another nice thing, so people were presenting large language models yesterday, so I thought it was important to put one in today, as supportive of that part of the community. ChatGPT, you asked them to look at nearly 8,000 Wall Street Journal articles about the Fed and ask it, does the article suggest any concern about the Fed making a mistake, an error, or an incorrect decision? And here you go. Not much early on, but then as inflation starts going up, it goes up and up and up. And then around the hawkish pivot, it then starts to come down and down again. There was also a Silicon Valley Bank spike in these worries, but that quickly died away. We also in the paper show that on these events, in a sort of narrow window, it led to declines. These speeches, these messaging led to declines in these term premia. Here's another thing, just one other aspect of this. We know that the Fed had adopted a new framework, the flexible average inflation targeting framework. In our models, this approach, which is known as FATE, is beautiful. Because what it says is if inflation has been too low, we will allow inflation go higher than our normal target. And if that goes because everyone's perfectly rational, perfectly forward-looking, they know this, and therefore their expected inflation goes up, it's like they lower the interest rate automatically. It has beautiful properties in the model. In reality, that's probably not how everybody forms their expectations, and it probably doesn't buy as much. And what you see here is that during that period where the Fed had its forward guidance in place, where it's trying to establish the credibility for FATE, the committee, from their own deliberations, from their own SEP revelations, was becoming more and more concerned about inflation going up. But unlike the past, when their concerns would go up and then they would start to tighten the Fed funds forecast, they didn't move at all. They stayed low until they then had to hawkishly pivot. So again, while forward guidance can be useful, it can also be constraining. So there's three more lessons here. The first one from this line of work is, yes, monetary policy may be 98% talk and only 2% action, but in that very same opening paragraph of Bernanke's blog, he also says, the cost of sending the wrong message can be high. Nobody ever cites that, except for Anna and I. So with term premia involved, and this is a quote from a former Fed policymaker, Jeremy Stein, the grip on the steering wheel is not as tight as it otherwise might be. The framework, the communication need to reflect the uncertainty that's inherent in policy. In other words, we find strong support for monetary policy being made with a sort of risk management strategy, and communication should reflect that. Lesson 5 builds off lesson 3. While forward guidance can be useful to communicate your reaction function, explicit forward guidance can actually be constraining. And appearing to be constrained can make the market worry you're going to make mistakes and fall behind the curve, which causes the tightening of the conditions anyway, undoing what you were trying to do with the forward guidance. Use it carefully. And lesson 6, while a big takeaway from our studies of the model and from communication is that we want to manage inflation expectations, I think we have to agree that some of our models make suggestions that we can micromanage them. I can make your inflation expectations go from 2.1 to 2.3 and then bring it back. I don't think we have that much control, so we should approximately manage them at the target, but we shouldn't try to be too clever. We should not micromanage them. Okay. That's the first half of the talk done. The second half, we have to shift. We have to shift audience, and as researchers, we shift methodology. While a lot of the traditional stuff, we look at natural language processing, market event studies, how do we assess the news, etc. Now we're going to go on to how can we make the broader public understand our messaging, and what's the right messaging for that broader public. So one way to think about this is that we've had communication revolutions. There was a time that monetary policy did not communicate. I realize that every year this becomes more and more obvious how old I'm getting. But the Federal Reserve, the most watched central bank in the world, did not even announce its decision when it made it in 1993. They only started in 1994. Now I can see some of the audience. Let me describe you collectively, like myself, as the grayer part of the audience. You're nodding, going, yeah, that wasn't that long ago. 1994, not that long. And I can see the sort of younger part of the audience going, 1994 is ancient history. But there was a time, the famous quote that always comes out from here is Hublot Norman's quote about the Bank of England, saying his motto was, never apologize, never explain. Or the press officer from the Bank of England whose job was to keep the bank out of the press and the press out of the bank. That's changed. With inflation targeting, with accountability, we must, as central banks, be transparent. And I hope I've convinced you from the first part that there's a benefit to being transparent, to being clear, to having open dialogue with the market. That basically went up until the financial crisis. We were developing all these communication devices, but we didn't really think about the normal person on the street. Why? Well, actually, in a lot of countries, the UK, my home country now included, after the financial crisis, with all of the bank bailouts that happened, with QE, with other things, public opinion about those central banks dropped. They went from being misunderstood but trusted to being actively misunderstood and not trusted. And as a result, central banks have had to start to try to win back the hearts and minds of the public, to create the case, to protect the case for central bank independence, which I think has served us so well as a macro policy institutional setup. So now the second revolution is how do we communicate in a way that engages a broader cross-section of society? Let me be very clear up front. We will never get through to everyone. We should accept that. But we can definitely do better than writing things that can only be read by 5% of the population. So this is Andrew Hauser, who's Deputy Governor of the RBA. I just think it's a very beautiful line. The benefits only accrue if we get our message across, not just to modern descendants of those top-hatted bankers. I think that's a beautiful description of old British bankers, but to the public at large. So that's our challenge. Okay. And as I said, the methodology has to change. We don't have lots of live minute-by-minute updates of what normal people are thinking. So one way we can understand if we get through is we can actually shift towards doing experiments. So in my career, I have become an accidental experimental economist. First time was completely by accident. Now I work with people who really know what they're doing, and they guide me. The basic idea of these is to randomize, like you would do in medical trials, to randomize treatments. So take in a bunch of people, randomly assign them to group, give some of them the traditional monetary policy statement to read, and give some of them a nicer, more curated version for the public. And then see if it affects what they think, how they like the bank, what they understood. That's what we do. This is a big area. I don't want to claim any sort of monopoly in here. There's many people doing this. Many of my students are doing this. Many of them probably doing it much better than me. First lesson I think we've gotten broadly from the literature is that actually, despite when I first thought about this issue, I thought there was no hope. I thought there was no hope we'd explain things in a way that people engaged with, understood, really took anything from. I was wrong. The evidence from the experiments shows that we can get through to these people, not as well as experts, but we can get through. But there are still challenges, and I've written about these in the past, and I list them under 3 E's: explanation, engagement, education. One of the most beautiful things about the initial experiments is they were all about explanation. And they looked like you could really get through. But of course, we paid people to read the central bank material. The engagement channel is, how do we make them interested so that they read it by themselves? The education one comes because there is a very strong correlation between how well people are educated, particularly about the economy and about the institutions of policy, and how much they trust those institutions, on how anchored their inflation expectations are. And there's a big question then, who does the education? Most central banks have an education department, but we also can't just rely on people going to the central bank website. How do we get this messaging into schools so that everybody, by the time they're 16 or 18, knows what the central bank does, knows how an interest rate works, knows why inflation is bad? These are challenges. Alan Blinder, who's, again, I think the sort of godfather of all the sort of thinking about central bank communication, he wrote in 2008, again, before people were really doing it, it may be time to pay some attention to communication with the general public. A decade later, he was quite pessimistic. Central banks will keep trying to communicate with the general public, as they should, but for the most part, they will fail. We're not quite another decade on yet, so we can't ask him his update. Let me give my version of the 2025 version. Central banks will, should, must keep trying to communicate with the general public, as they should. And while they may fail in large part, I actually am optimistic that they will get through more than we think. So there's an optimism there. Okay. I have worked with Matthew Naylor, who's at the Bank of England. I'm going to summarize it here. A lot of this stuff had focused on what we call semantic complexity. Like, do we use big words, long sentences, non-monosyllabic words? I think it's very fun that the word non-monosyllabic is very much non-monosyllabic. Versus a different type of issue, and apologies to the people who came on Monday and Tuesday, they heard me tell this story before. My older sister was a nuclear physicist, and her PhD thesis. Now, I've got lots of years of education. The usual way of measuring how hard something is to read is to say, you need 10 years of education to read this. You need 15 years of education. I'm above all of those years of education, but I couldn't read the abstract to her PhD thesis because it used words and concepts. I had no idea what they were. Could I have tried? Yeah, I could have. Well, when she wrote it, it didn't exist, but I could now go into Wikipedia and start trying to look up all these terms and teach myself this stuff. But that's harder than just a long sentence, which, as I teach my kids to read, you say, put your thumb over the second part, read the first part. So we had this idea that concepts may be the issue, not the length of sentence, the big words. So we did an experiment. And what you see is exactly that both for perceived understanding, for actual understanding, the real driver of less ability to understand is things that are conceptually complex. So when we say terms like inflation and output gap, rather than prices and jobs, we lose people. We lose their understanding. This also translates when you have a highly conceptually difficult thing, they also then report less levels of trust, less willingness to engage, and less understanding of what the bank does. This is all for the Bank of England, but I have no reason to think it's specific to them. So the lesson from this is we got to think more about the economic concepts than we do just thinking about, oh, if we make the words a bit shorter or a shorter sentence, it's all going to be fine. Second point from research. This is research I have with Ryan Rolls, who was working at Oxford, is now back in University of Mississippi. We like to think when the central bank puts its forecast out that this is a useful anchor of inflation expectations. And there is evidence to suggest that it is. However, the moment you most want to anchor inflation expectations is just when you've missed the inflation target. So we asked the question, if you make errors, does that change how much people put weight on your forecast when you release it? The takeaway is, yes, they do. This suggests there isn't some fixed trust in the central bank, but that credibility, at least in terms of how much they use your information to update theirs, that evolves, and it evolves with your performance as central bankers. So just when you miss the inflation target, they put least weight on your signals. That's a big challenge and one that we have to overcome. But what we show is that you can overcome it with communication. So you can talk about the errors, you can talk about the mistakes, and this can help. Okay, I know I'm running short on time. Let me jump through to the last. We're nearly there, getting there. So again, with Ryan and with Peter Rickards, who's he's one of my students now, but will be going back to the Reserve Bank of Australia soon. We try to get to the question about what we can call the model in people's heads. If you say to someone, the central bank is raising interest rates, there's a lot of decisions that they have to make that requires them to think, what does this mean for the future? Now, people don't, as I joked earlier, they don't have MATLAB, they don't solve things forward, but they do form some view. And there is evidence from Peter Andre and Chris Roth and Johannes Wolfart and others that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the models people use. And I'm going to show you some evidence of that, but I also want to give you a positive message that central banks can teach them to have different mental models. Okay, this is a big experiment. This is an expensive experiment. The basic idea is we do a main treatment. Again, this is like an experiment, but now we'll be giving some people a control, the kind of placebo group. We're going to give one type of education, which is going to be like a central bank statement, but with more narrative written in it. Another group are going to get a little written description of the state of the world and how it works. And the last group are going to have the same material, but they're going to watch a video with me. But I promise, I'm going to put this online shortly, but the video, I tried to be as monotone and boring as possible. I didn't want my enthusiasm to affect there. I think you could, maybe it would work great. So we did that, and then we checked how it affected their beliefs, what they understood of the world. We then followed up with them 3 weeks later and asked them again how they understood the world. Then we did it again at 6 weeks. That's nice because that's like a typical kind of monetary policy cycle. So maybe you get in the press every 6 weeks, you have a chance to influence these views. But we then did another follow-up after 14 weeks. So this is now 20 weeks after someone watched a little 4 or 5 minute video of me explaining very basic ideas of how the economy works. And then we asked them if they understand how the economy works. And I'm going to show you some of the results, but they are quite interesting. Here's one. So there's a general fact about how do people understand how shocks hit the economy. Households typically think everything is a supply shock. So if you ask them about what will happen after a positive oil price shock, they mostly say inflation will go up and unemployment will go up. Okay, so they do okay on that. And when we teach them the blue line, they get a bit more convinced of that, but they were already kind of right to start with, so it's not that big an effect. If you tell them that government spending goes up, they also think unemployment will go up and inflation will go up. They have the same positive correlation. Sorry, the red is the posteriors. But you can see that with those, we can completely switch their view with this teaching. We can, with very simple messaging, switch their view to think this is the real way. Here you can see, like, some people switch randomly, but a big group who thought that it was a demand shock was actually like a supply shock and got it wrong, now get it right. Let me show you this one. If you go then on unemployment, so initially we asked them about what happens if a central bank increases interest rates. What happens? They get activity pretty right, but initially 47% of them think it will lower rates, inflation, and about nearly 40% think it will raise it. So not quite half have the complete wrong view. When they see you put up interest rates, they think you're creating inflation. Now, that's in our models. We have a thing called the cost channel, but we know it's dominated by the other channels, and this is bad for trust. Imagine you're at home and you're thinking, gosh, inflation is bad. Hopefully the central bank will help. And then they come out and say, don't worry, we're helping, we're raising rates. And you think, but when you raise rates, you raise inflation. They're making it worse. Why are they making it worse? Your trust doesn't go up in that type of institution. So we teach them, and we switch to 67%, and after 20 weeks, 65% are still getting it right. Just in case you're interested, in the survey of experts by Andre et al., 67% of economically trained people was the response rate. So we can almost create, with one small intervention, equivalent of economic experts, at least on the direction of this. And that's hopefully 65, 67% of people who see you raise rates and think, this is good, they are helping. You can see it across. The biggest effects are the educational text and the video. So, take away from this, people understand more than we might have expected, and we can improve understanding with more guidance on mechanisms. Take away, we have to explain mechanisms to people, even basic ones. Interesting thing on credibility, though. The same treatment, if you look up here, this is the control. The control group weren't told nothing. They were just told that the central bank has these functions. They try to control inflation, they control payment systems, they look after financial stability, blah, blah, blah. Even just telling them what the central bank does improved answers to all sorts of questions about credibility, whether the central bank fights inflation, is clear, transparent comms, actions benefit the economy, keeps inflation low, and follows a policy rule. So this is ongoing work now. This we haven't finished, and this is my favorite slide because my lesson is a picture of Dr. Nick. It might be that you don't actually have to have people fully understand everything you do as a central bank, but they have to understand what you're trying to do, what your objectives are. I describe this as being like heart surgeons, because most of us don't know the detail of what heart surgeons do. Most of us are not trained. We don't know exactly which incision for which valve and what thing works best or not. But if we have problems, we trust ourselves that the heart surgeon will do the surgery. We know there are risks. We know sometimes it goes wrong. But we still do it because we think they are benevolent and helping us. Maybe central bankers can be like that. You don't have to understand how we do a forecast, but you just understand we do it because we're trying to fight inflation, because we're trying to help the economy. Ongoing. Okay, let me give one criticism and then I'll finish up with two quick lessons from other people's work, both students of mine. We ask people if they understand the reaction function. So we give them a little example. There's an unexpected rise in inflation and a decline in unemployment. Inflation has risen unexpectedly from 2 to 4. Unemployment rate has declined. We would like you to forecast for how it would set inflation. We asked them this. Anyway, we get actually quite a strong response. People on average seem to know. About 66% of people get the right reaction function in line with what experts would say. But then we give them an actual Federal Open Market Committee statement, but with the decision eliminated, and ask them to read this thing, which you will all as central bankers read and go, that's beautiful. Look at that, beautiful. Oh, inflation and jobs have gained and this is nice. And I've told them about the economy. Surely they then can extrapolate the right choice. And remember, this is on a group of people, 2/3 of whom, in a very simple example, can get it right. Here's the picture. Here's their hypothetical scenario accuracy. Here's what would happen if they just gave a random guess, because they only had to get whether rates stayed the same, went up, or went down. Here's what they actually say. They are worse than random after reading the Fed statement. You have taken people who, not you, the Fed, have taken people who are 66% right with a basic idea, so they get the idea. You've shown them how you communicate, and you've made them worse than random guessers. Even the most treated, which is that they tend to be better at getting decreased scenarios than increased scenarios. I don't know if people are just more inclined to decrease rates, they guess that more. But even those are not statistically better than random. This is crazy. What's my takeaway? Well, actually, let's ask how well the AI can do it. Human expert, that's actually Michael. I'm pretty good. I've read a lot of these things. In the language of AI, this is an internal forecast because I've read all these before. I don't remember them, just in case anyone says, you remember them. I'm not like, I don't have some photographic memory, but I read them, I know how these are written. I've spent 25 years in and around central banks. I know how we talk. I can guess. I don't get it perfectly, but I get, on the increase-decrease ones, I get about 90% accuracy. Random would be 33%. ChatGPT does okay, but again, ChatGPT also has most of these in its learning samples, so it also may be internally forecasting. Most other language models in this example don't do well. This is, Felix Drinkall is a data scientist who we work with on this, and even things like Roberta or a thing we developed, Narrative Graph, really struggles. Why? Well, we're trying to figure this out. Is it because of the style of the FOMC statement? The ECB now tries to put narrative in theirs. Will theirs do better? I don't know, but the ongoing lesson here is, I just think we need to focus on narrative, the basic story, not all the data. We hide too often behind the data and the numbers as if it speaks for itself. Going back to my early stuff, it doesn't speak for itself. We can all look at the same data and come to different conclusions. Just tell us what your exact conclusion is and why. Last of my lessons, this is also ongoing. Fan chart coming under attack by the Bernanke review for the Bank of England, so we're trying to explore what type of things might replace it. And the basic idea is, I think that the key trade-off when you think about communication of uncertainty, and this comes from some of Ryan's other work and Luba Peterson's work, the key trade-off is influence today versus influence in the future. If you communicate a point forecast with bands, you have less influence today. But the likely gain is that when you're wrong in the future, when your forecast is wrong in the future, people accept that, yes, they said they weren't going to be definitely right. If you just say, here's the number, this is what it will be, people will pay more attention today, but then when you're wrong in the future, they'll be like, they told me it was going to be 2.2. Why is it 4? They must be idiots. That's my assessment of the challenge, but we still have to work on exactly the best way to communicate. 2 last lessons, and I stop, both from students of mine and other people. So Peter has worked on the media. One of the natural things to think about with communicating with the public is they don't engage with the central bank directly, so the media is important, and the media is the key channel, and there can be costs in terms of the precision of understanding the decision and the perceptions of the bank, because the media doesn't just report what we want. And finally, interesting work, particularly for Europe, Alina Vabic shows that the messenger matters. So if I am an Irishman talking to an audience of Irish people, I have more influence than if you stick me in front of the French, the Germans, or the Italians. I don't know, maybe someone can do the research, I don't know if this applies to southern Brazilians talking to northern Brazilians. That's research that one of you can do. Thank you very much for indulging my 15 lessons. I think the fact that there are 15 represent important progress. We're doing okay as researchers in academia and central banks in the private sector, and that's great. There's still loads to do, which is also exciting for us in the room. Maybe what's less exciting, and I'm looking over at the front row here, is that some of you in the room have to actually try to implement these lessons. And for you, I will leave you with a wish of bravery and success in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor McMahon, for such a wonderful, comprehensive, and engaging lecture on communication of monetary policy and central bank communication. I will open the floor for the audience. I guess we have time for, I'm looking for guidance here, 2 or 3 questions. So there's one here, and there's one in the back there.
Hello. Hi, thank you, Professor Michael, for a wonderful explanation, and research on communication is very useful. And I wonder, if you can share your thoughts on how central banks can handle uncertainty right now and communicate that uncertainty. For example, the Bank of Canada, they are offering 2 forecasts instead of a baseline forecast to illustrate the uncertainty regarding how tariffs are going to affect inflation and growth. And other central banks are struggling, trying to show in the forecast how difficult it is to stick to a baseline scenario, etc. So what will be your recommendation for central banks in this conjuncture?
Do you want to take the 3 and then, yeah.
Vamos pegar as perguntas todas, depois ele faz uma rodada de resposta.
Maybe I should have started answering in between just to, anyway, we're taking questions now, it's fine. Yeah.
Hello. Yes, now it's working. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. Very interesting. So I kept thinking about your lesson number 4, the idea of, the risk of sending a wrong signal. In an area where this becomes pretty critical at central banks, which departs from monetary policy, is the introduction of the countercyclical capital buffer in financial stability units. This is quite interesting, right? Because in many countries it means we are assigning a policy tool to units within central banks, business units, that have never had this tool before. And the problem, connecting this to your literature, to your own work, is that we lack a proper target in opposite to a monetary policy where we always look at the short-term interest rate. We can communicate why the central bank is delaying or anticipating a decision. In this context, in financial stability, considering the CCYB, this becomes kind of more challenging, and you see central banks around discussing which is the proper metric that they should use to communicate decisions on the CCYB. So I was wondering if you could briefly comment on your take on this. I will be very curious to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for the great lessons. My question comes around the matter of communication and educating the public about the concepts and the direction of the effects of monetary policy. A lot of these concepts are, at least in Brazil, and where there's a lack of general understanding of the concepts of economic. There's a kind of dispute of this concept, of this understanding at how you get them through to the public, not just intellectually or conceptually, but in terms of direction. So it's not as clear to the general public, as you said, how the interest rates should be to control inflation, or even if they are able to control inflation at all. So this dispute comes not just intellectually, but also politically. at some contexts. So I would like to know your opinion of, should the central bank communication address this kind of political risk of taking the control of the narrative, of educating in the economic standards that we have, or should this not be treated by the communication at all? So thank you.
Yep, excellent. Okay, three great questions. Anna, I get to answer in a beautifully economist way. It depends. So, no, first of all, it really depends on who you're trying to talk to, okay? So let me give one example. So what you described about scenario communication is the hot topic in central banks and forecasts, and absolutely, I think it's a good way to communicate with a sophisticated audience. So when you communicate with the financial markets, and let's be honest, so I had this fun time recently. I was in Shenzhen and Hong Kong, and I gave dinner talks on 4 nights in a row. And this was right around the week. It was the week after the tariffs first came on, and it was the week where they were on, they were off, they were on, all sorts of different things. And in that part of the world, of course, the Chinese ones going to 145% was the big news. Every night of the talk, my talk was different. It was the same talk. It's just overnight, between the talk and the second talk, some were off, some were on, some were higher, markets had collapsed. And so we don't know. The markets know we don't know, because they don't know. So they also are sophisticated enough to understand conditionality. So scenarios are just conditionality in forecasts. If the tariffs stay at this level, this is where we think we'll be. If they're not, this is where we will. When talking to the public, I am not convinced that they understand conditionality well at all. Again, the example I gave of countries where forward guidance has led to job losses because of political outrage were largely because, I always think forward guidance is always conditional. Because we think the economy will stay weak, we're going to keep rates low even for longer. We're going to make sure we see recovery. They saw that as an unconditional statement, even though it's conditional. So I think with the public, we have to be a little wary that we don't put out, here's 3 different views. The one thing I would say, though, so I don't have a magic bullet yet, the work I'll present in a couple of, in next month at the Bank of England, we're trying to do work to exactly understand with the public how you can communicate this stuff. So I'll send it to you as soon as I have it. But the one thing I would say it slightly amuses me, how regularly we use the term unprecedented uncertainty. It can't always be unprecedented. It might be different uncertainty, but basically since the financial crisis, we've had 7 or 8 episodes of unprecedented uncertainty. That's like once every 2 years we're in unprecedented uncertainty. That's precedented. Much like we shouldn't call it unconventional monetary policy anymore. It's pretty conventional. It's just different. But anyway, sorry, that's a little linguistic issue for me. Going to the point about the communication on other topics. Well, I've done almost all of my work on communication of monetary policy. I have done a little bit on communication of financial stability issues. I just was involved with Claudio Borio and Elena Carletti, a review of the Bank of Spain's financial stability department, and part of that was looking at the communication. So I got pretty close to the coalface of these issues. And again, I would agree with what you say. I think with these things, the costs of sending the wrong message are probably even higher. We're not talking 50 basis points. And even for the reputation, if the central bank is seen to give the financial sector a clean bill of health and we have a financial crisis the next year, I think that's a disaster. And again, if you look back at the history of Ireland, you will see one of those type events. So I agree. Actually, I think even that a lot of the things like stress testing and even the countercyclical capital buffer, these are much harder concepts for the public. So I'm actually of the opinion with the public, we just need to send we're watching, we're checking, we're doing what we can. It's not perfect, but we're doing it. Trust us, please. We're working real hard to make sure this is right. I don't think we should try and communicate how a countercyclical capital buffer works, because we know that that doesn't even work very well with some of the boards of directors of these banks. So I think that the technicality involved requires a completely different two-pronged approach. But there's Ricardo Correa at the Fed. He's done quite a lot of work on this, and I would anyone interested, I would point in Sorry, I'm looking at you because we talked a lot about this recently. There are people in Brazil who are going to do PhD theses thinking about this issue. So next time ask her, not me. But yeah, that's all I can say. And finally, on education, I think it's a great question. My work says that we can explain it, that we can get through. But your question was not about whether we could, it was whether we should. And it was really the question of politics. I've spent the last 6 years as a member of Ireland's Fiscal Advisory Council, which has put me closer to politics than central bank type people like my earlier self like to be. But let me say two things that make, I think, our job hard, and then the politics answer. The one thing I think makes our job very hard is that most of the big effects come from what economists or macroeconomists would call the general equilibrium effects. General equilibrium effects are usually sort of invisible. They're how the whole system responds. So again, if I think about the cost channel of monetary policy, yes, firms that have debt now have to pay more to service that debt. Why don't they put up prices if their costs have gone up? Well, some of them do, but most of them don't because they understand that everybody else is spending less, and that if they put their price up, they risk losing market share in a falling market, so they fight hard to avoid doing it, and they even try to put costs down. That's how it works. People don't see the general equilibrium part, so they just see the direct effect, and they attribute that to policy. That's a challenge. That's one we have to rise to. The politics, here's two answers. One is my own, and one is somebody else's. My own one is, if you're not out there putting your narrative in the world, somebody else will be. And we know from misinformation and social media that that other narrative might be more viral, might penetrate more deeply, and might be completely wrong. It might even be dangerous. So even if we can't fight that completely, you have to have your narrative out there. Because let's say you get a narrative, you open TikTok, and there's someone telling you about the lizard people at the central bank and how they are sending money to the wrong people and it's all bad. You might be of the type who just goes, okay, I believe that. Okay, that's terrible. But you're in this room, so you're not. So what would a person like you do? You'd go to the central bank website, you'd look things up. And there has to be messaging that you can understand that makes you go, actually, that's different. No, I trust these guys now. So that's one answer. The second is, if we want to minimize the costs of political interference, we have to have the public supporting us. So we were talking yesterday about the central bank here and their success with the PICs, right? Being seen to be useful, to improve things, to make things better, helps. So take credit for those, but equally take credit for fighting inflation, take credit for stabilizing recessions and making them less bad. In the midst of this, if you convince people that the central bank is good, so Paul Tucker used to use this line, that politicians are better than technocrats at winning hearts and minds of the public. It's their job. They get votes. We don't get votes, right? So his view was, you can't beat them at that, but you can surround them. And what it means to surround them is you make the people they talk to say, no, I like the Bank of Brazil. The Bank of Brazil is great. It gave me this, it gave me that, it fights inflation, it fights recessions. Why would you attack them? Politicians don't take on fights if they're going to lose votes. So there's two reasons. One, your narrative should be out there. And two, if you build a public support for yourself, the politicians don't interfere. I'll stop there.
Professor Michael, I'm sure we would love to keep talking to you, listening to you a bit more. I'll try to stick a little bit to time. I'll invite everybody to give a last round of applause to Professor McMahon. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael McMahon, for your enthusiastically full of optimism lecture. Agradecemos à diretora Izabela Correa diretora de Relacionamento, Cidadania e Supervisão de Conduta
and Conduct Supervision at the Central Bank of Brazil. And once more, Professor Michael McMahon. We remind you that immediately after the break, the macroeconomic academic sessions will take place in this auditorium, Octavio Gouveia de Bulhões Auditorium, and the microeconomics sessions will take place in the auditorium next door, Daniel Nogueira Auditorium, 15 meters away, right across the hall. The keynote lecture that has just taken place today was broadcast live on the Central Bank of Brazil's YouTube channel and will remain available for public access. The academic sessions that will follow will be recorded and made available at a later date on the events page on the Central Bank's website. We will now take a 30-minute break. We invite everyone to the coffee that is being served in the lobby of the auditoriums.